Hi everybody, we're back, and this time I'm going to finish what I started. Last time hopefully, maybe you didn't even watch the first video, hopefully you didn't. Last time I had great trouble setting up n8n on my local machine. I had trouble sending any kind of webhook to any kind of API call to my cloud function. And I had just problems with everything, but I figured it all out. So I'll explain for anybody who did actually go through the horror of the last video. I'll explain what the problem was. Problem number one, I already had n8n installed on my computer before, but it was uninstalled, I guess, but it had saved the config file. So it thought that I had already set up the admin account. So it wasn't just letting me in, it was saying, yeah, okay, this is your n8n, sure, but what's your username and password? It was waiting to get the username and password from my previous n8n installation, which I found out is in, if you need to know this for yourself as well, is in the .n8n folder in your user root directory. You'll find a file called config or n8n.config or something like that, some version of config, and that file will have your username and password and all this kind of stuff in it. What was it? No, it wasn't config. Wait, let me get you the real answer to the question. My other conversations. It was, yes, it was the database for n8n. They have an SQLite database that contains the data from your previous install, like the admin username, password, and all that stuff. So I just had to delete basically the admin database, this database.sqlite, and then when I restarted it, it went ahead and created all of these. It did a migration, I guess. It set up all the different bits of the app as if it's starting for the first time, and then let me open it with this admin mode. So we'll get back to that in a second. Problem number two was because I was passing in data to my cloud function through params and through body form data and all that kind of stuff. And it seems, I mean, maybe this is just me setting up the API wrong, but where it started working was when I actually just passed in a raw JSON object. So you can pass in an object with params in it into your backend, and then you'll see that produces this. Oh, let's do a test and I'll show you. So it's not telling me I'm a genius anymore. Sarcastically. So you can see there params, API key, and headers, so it's all good. It's got the request in. So I made the function separate out the request from the parameters. So it waits for the request object coming from the API call, and then it pulls out the parameters and outputs them, so that then I can test this parameter API key. So params.api key in an expression node. You can access stuff in an expression node using dot notation from objects, which is really handy. You can also do it with in the expression node. You can also do, like, you know, the first result kind of stuff, like the first, if you had an array of parameters, it could be the first parameter, for example. Anyway, so the expression node is cool. That's what I'm trying to say. It can do more than you think it can do, actually. It's very good. So that's sending out the right response. There's some super secret API key is there. If I want to add more stuff to that, then I just have to make another thing, like what was it? User ID, test user, and then there was also email ID we wanted to put in. Test email. It's great when it all just works. There's nothing better than when it all just works. But yeah. So that I didn't even have to put in these parameters, actually. Probably could have done. No, it doesn't work. So no, better just use a body, like a raw JSON body API call, and then you just parse it out on your end. Anyway, it's probably safer to do it that way. It means you can kind of check things before they go any further. So yeah, that's all working. That's great. Those are the two things that were broken. So coming back to n8n, yes, right. So now we're going to do our funky sudo pm2 and what was it, run? No, can't remember. What was the command for pm2? Where are you? Haven't done it in a while. pm2 start n8n. There we go. That'll do. Doesn't know it. Okay. Oh yeah, that was the problem we had last time because I changed over from ZSH to bash and it went back to ZSH, whatever. Let's just start n8n and we'll assume that you guys will be able to do it with pm2 because your system isn't going crazy. So it's started up, it's ready to rock, and the first time you open it, you're going to see this. So set up owner account. This is super important. You need to set it up and save it somewhere precious and never lose it, because then if you ever do a second install and get stuck like I did in the first video, you won't have any problems. I do not want security vulnerabilities information. I don't have an SMTP server set up. You can get an SMTP server set up in here. I think that was written in the GitHub guide or the guide for something. There's a guide, the documentation website. In here, there's a guide on how to set up the whole like SMTP server, so you can send emails and invite users and all that stuff, and probably just so you can send like local emails as well. So you might want to look through this stuff and actually set up a config file, or look at setting these things into the config file that we looked at just before. If you need some of these things, then that could be useful. But right now, not. Oh, nobody cares. Okay, so it takes us straight into our first workflow, but we can also just go out and have a look at our dashboard, start from scratch. This is where we create workflows. They have a billion templates that you can use, so it's really, really nice community fed templates. So you can look up like, OpenAI, and it'll give you some ChatGPT stuff that you can do. Telegram AI chatbot, so like, taking messages from Telegram and pumping them into OpenAI. So you can clone any of these and just use them straight up in your space, easy peasy. You have to connect Telegram to it, obviously. Like, these kind of integrations require a credential. So you need to create credentials with your Telegram API key or whatever OpenAI API key. You're going to need that as well. So it's really nice that this is all like set up and easy to use. Leave without saving, please. But we're going to start from scratch. We want to have a webhook. We want to have a webhook. Start when a webhook is called. And we get a test URL. And this test URL is at the moment using localhost. You'll also see it saying localhost if you do this in your AWS setup. If you're running an npm AWS version of like an EC2 server and running n8n, you're also going to see localhost. It's really important that you don't work with localhost, because inside the AWS environment, it's in localhost, and you can call it from other apps in your localhost. But what you want to do when you're actually running this in production is to replace localhost with the IP address of your AWS instance and open up port 5678 to the public. So open that in the AWS security rules. If you have a firewall in your server, open that in the firewall as well. And then you'll be able to make calls to and from that server, especially going into that server from outside the server. You need the IP address in the place of localhost, of course. But for this purpose, we don't, because we're running this all locally. So we can actually do this locally, and we can call this locally. With this URL, you have a test URL and a production URL. Test URL is when you're in the editor doing the nodes, and production URL is when you save and you make it active. Then the production URL is the one that gets called to an active webhook, and you don't have to be there to have it execute. That makes sense. So we can add authentication if we want to make it really safe and secure, or not. We can have it respond immediately or respond when the last webhook node fires. So if I have like this webhook and then it sends an email, we would need to have this hooked up to something, but let's say that this works because we have our credentials stored somewhere, and it's going to send an email. Then afterwards, it's going to respond to webhook. and it's going to take the incoming item and use that as a response. And that means that then this will respond using respond to webhook node. It could also be when last node finishes. You can just have it send whatever the data is from the last node. So it returns the data of the last executed node. If you just want the raw data from that node, it's enough, then that's fine. You don't need the response to webhook node, but the response to webhook node gives you a little bit more control over what happens at the end. So we'll use that one. But what we want to actually do for our example is we don't want to respond with a webhook node. We want to respond immediately. We're not even going to have a response to webhook node. We're going to imagine that this is doing a call to OpenAI. And we're going to create a completion here. We're going to have a chat with OpenAI. We're going to execute on that. And then at the end, it's going to do an HTTP request. And where is it going to request to? It's going to request to this address. So it's going to post to our localhost address, no authentication, and it's going to send a body. The body type is going to be raw, and it's going to send, so application JSON, and it's going to send the body, which is going to be something like response. It all worked great. And there we go. Okay, I don't actually have an OpenAI connection, so I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to do a code node. Why not? So the code node can run either JavaScript or Python. For all incoming items, it's going to run something like this: item.json.myNewField equals 1. So it's just going to say, I don't know, what could we do? Item, well, just whatever, it doesn't matter. Just leave it the way it is, and it can just run and execute, and we'll see what happens. So it's going to run some code, and then it's going to do that HTTP request. So I'm just setting this up just so you can see how it works from start to finish. So this is good. This is saved. Now, once you've done this and you're happy with it, like say you've got to a certain point with it, I highly recommend that you go and do download. And it's going to download the workflow, give it a name. Well, I mean, it can be named here, so we can call it tutorial Noodle workflow. And then, yeah, when you download it, it'll have that name. So save that somewhere, save it as like V1 or something like that, put it in a folder and keep it somewhere safe, because then you can import it afterwards. If you have a new n8n, say you move from local to production in your Amazon environment, or you decide to take a subscription and you move to the online version, something like that, then this is a good way to keep your creations safe and secure. And even if there's updates to versions or anything like that, you're not going to get screwed over. So that's all good. So what are we expecting to happen here? We're expecting that our app is going to call the webhook to, I mean, I said it was going to send an email to SES, but I just want to do something simple to get this example done. So it's going to call the webhook. It's going to respond immediately and say, all good, we're gravy. Let's say it's going to give raw body response. No, what's it going to give? JSON response. Response data. Success. So let's say step 1, okay. Something like that. It's just going to respond immediately. It's going to run whatever's here, and whenever it gets here, I mean, I can tell it to wait, for example. I'm going to tell it to wait for 3 seconds, 5 seconds, not 5 hours. Just we're going to use this as an example of how this could be, you know, ChatGPT thinking about the code that it's going to return, or the conversation that it's going to return, and it could be 5 minutes, you know. So obviously we don't want to wait for the webhook to respond, because Noodle will time out. We need it to respond immediately and then to send its answer in another call that's going to do directly into the Noodle. So that's going to come into here. It's going to fail because there's no API key. You need to put in the API key. API, oops, API key, some super secret key. Now it's safe, super safe. And so send email, we're going to trigger this from within our app. So when I send it, it's going to do an HTTP request, so the function. No, we're going to do make an API call to this address. Yeah, webhook test, sorry. Do the, oh no, webhook test, yeah, that's right. So, never mind, we're going to do a call to that address, yes. With no body. Oh, great. Make an API call to this endpoint with no authentication or body. I'm going to go to my experiments page, and this button is going to test n8n call, and this is going to call our cloud function, and it's going to be the send email function, which is not sending an email anymore, but you know, we're doing it all for science, and if it's successful, it's going to set that string, whatever, just for fun. Okay, so what's it actually going to do? Const URL equals localhost da 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 da. Try response await fetch URL. Just a nice simple fetch. That's what we like. And I'll put the response. Okay, so we've got this ready to go. We've got our button ready to go. We're going to jump over. We're going to click the button. We're going to look at what happens in n8n. Then we're going to look what's happened in receive response. It's all very exciting. I'm getting very excited. And so yeah, let's do it. So listen for test event. We need to do the test event first. So let's do the test event first. Test n8n call, run success. Done. So there we go. Comes from localhost. It's all empty. Great. So then it's going to run this code node. What does it output? Nothing. It adds a new field. Sorry, it maps a new field to the JSON that we received, the item that we've just processed, which you can see here. It's nice the way that they lay all this stuff out, you know. You can drag and drop stuff into fields as well when there's data in the query or in the body. It's all really nicely done. I love the way it's like table, JSON, schema, like it's so, I love n8n. So that's great. It's running its nice little code there. It's going to wait 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's longer than 5 seconds. And then it's going to make an HTTP request, and we should be able to see that if we play that step. Oh, it doesn't work. Unsupported protocol localhost. I beg your pardon. Oh, okay. Sorry. And oh, it's been triggered. What came through? It all worked great. And with the super secret key, it sends a success response. Love it. So that means if we make this execute, the execute will wait for the test call, and then it'll run all the different nodes and show you the execution data. So it's waiting for the event. I'm going to trigger it, and then if you see this fire, it means that n8n is run successfully. After 5 seconds, of course, because we have to wait for it to respond. Ta-da! So it's come through with the request, some super secret key, all went fine. And you can see that send email has run twice now. And the response data was just workflow has started. So it's returned this to our API call. Noodl can carry on doing whatever it needs to do, and n8n will take care of the rest and can make calls. It can make one call, it can make 2 calls, it can make as many calls as you want back to back to Noodle. You can have branching calls, you can have filters and switches and ifs and all stuff like that. If the value is this, then do this, and if it's this, then do this, and it's super, super useful. So that is how we set up n8n and connect it to an API in Noodle, and then have the response to the API processed by Noodle, so you could then process by creating data, updating the database, stuff like that. You need to pass through information like user ID or email ID here when we first make the call, have it stored in n8n somewhere as a variable, and then pass back at the end to say, okay, here's the answer for user ID equals and email ID equals. And then on the other side, you've got your receive response saying, okay, let's find this user ID, let's find this email ID, and now we process them, put them together, and make something out of that. And so this is how I would use the Noodle backend and n8n as a backend to communicate with your app. And if we go one step further, we're not going to go into it today, but if you take it one step further with the open source version of the backend of Noodle, we will have access to parse. We already kind of have access to parse backend. We'll be able to make API calls directly into parse. So potentially somebody in the community could build an integration with n8n and parse and have that. I don't think there is one yet. No. We could make an integration with parse and have it communicate directly with the parse backend to insert data into the database, to read data from the database, and do all the things that we can do, for example, with the bubble nodes in n8n, create an object, delete an object. We can make it maybe like bulk creating objects, things like that sometimes take a bit longer or a bit less reliable in Noodle and could be more reliable here because we have the full execution data of every execution that ever happens. So once you run it live, you can go and filter through all of the executions that have ever happened and look at exactly what information came in, what information, how was it processed, what information went out. So you have an incredible amount of detail as well over the processes that are happening in your backend. So this is super useful and really a lot of fun. So yeah, sorry, I could talk about it all day, so I'm going to stop myself, but I hope you get the idea. I hope this has been useful, and